Hey everyone, Taehyung here. Before anything else, I just want to feel you for a second where you're listening from, what time it is, what the air around you feels like. Drop your country in the comments. I'll read them. Tonight feels heavier than most nights. People think BTS is this eternal constellation of seven unshakable stars, voices perfectly aligned, destiny carved in gold. And maybe from the outside, it really did look that way. The laughter, the arms thrown over shoulders, the inside jokes, the synchronized chaos backstage before the lights hit, all of it felt like a world built on unbreakable glue. But glue can hide cracks too, and sometimes the cracks are mine. This isn't the kind of story you wrap in celebration. It's the one you swallow when the stadium screams your name and your heart whispers someone else. Jungkook always carried light naturally, golden Maknae, global pop gravity, a voice that could cradle entire arenas into silence. And me? I became someone who watched that brilliance too quietly, thinking silence was a form of loyalty, thinking timing was something I could negotiate later, thinking feelings could be paused like choreography cues. They can't. Jungkook saw me once. Not Hyung, not bandmate, not image, just me. And the way he looked at me in those unfiltered moments felt like subtitles the universe added without permission. We never talked in long speeches, we talked in existence, in pauses, in shared breaths at 35,000 feet, in the quiet hum between sound checks, but presence without truth has an expiration date. I didn't know that back then. I thought silence kept him safe. I was wrong. Silence just kept me scared. And that fear slowly wrote a story no one got to read until now. When the world talks about Jungkook, they talk about gold. Golden Maknae, golden voice, golden trajectory. They talk about records, sold-out tour, global influence, that gravity he carries without effort. But no one ever talks about the moments when the gold turns warm, human, and quiet. The moments when he forgets the world is watching and just exists in the most ordinary, devastatingly beautiful way. I've seen those moments up close, closer than most people ever will. And those are the moments that hurt the deepest now, because they remind me of a version of us that I can't return to, no matter how much I want to rewrite time. I want to take you back to a night that doesn't sound extraordinary when you summarize it, but felt seismic when you lived it. We were backstage in Lowe's Angels. The tour was at its loudest peak, the kind of loud that shakes foundations. The crowd had been impossible to top, oceans of phones like artificial stars, chants so synchronized it felt ritualistic, the kind of energy that brands itself onto your bones. After the final bow, the members dispersed in that familiar post-show haze, some buzzing, some exhausted, all of us carried by adrenaline. Staff rushed around rolling cables, shouting cues, coordinating the chaos. But in the corner of all that noise, there was a pocket of quiet that felt like a world separate from the rest. Jungkook was sitting there, shoulders slightly slumped, hair damp at the edges from sweat, hoodie zipped halfway like he didn't care about symmetry for once. He was scrolling through something on his phone, thumb moving lazily, no rush, no mask, no posture, just him. Human, tired, real. I didn't even realize I was walking toward him until I stopped myself halfway. That hesitation is a ghost that keeps packing around me, because once upon a time I never hesitated. I would have sat beside him, made some stupid joke, nudged his shoulder, listened to whatever he was cooking up in his headphones. I would have filled that silence with presence. But that night, presence felt like a sentence I didn't know how to finish. He looked up not dramatically, not with expectation, just with instinct. He smiled at me, not the press smile, not the stage smile, the other one. The one that flickers for less than a second if you're not paying attention. The one that says, "I see you, Hyung." My heart nearly combusted on the spot. And the terrifying thing is I know that smile was real. It wasn't for cameras. It wasn't for choreography. It was for me. And that's why it hurt. Because the look that passed between us in that tiny, unplanned moment felt heavier than anything we performed on stage. I remember the air in LA being cool that night, a contrast to the suffocating heat of performance lights. I remember the faint smell of hairspray, sweat, and cold metal from the stage equipment. I remember thinking that moment was mine to pocket for later bravery. But bravery never showed up on schedule. I told myself, later, not here, not now. And that sentence became a gravestone for a moment that deserved a future. Fans think heartbreak happens with a loud ending, a goodbye, a public crack. But heartbreak can also happen in moments where someone smiles at you with everything they're not allowed to say, and you smile back with everything you're too scared to admit. Jungkook didn't know I almost shattered right there, but maybe he did. He has always listened in frequencies beyond words. He senses shifts in silence the way some people sense storms before rain. He was humming something later that night, not loudly, just under his breath, a melody that sounded familiar but wasn't one of our official tracks. It took me a second to realize it was a fragment of something I once played in the practice room during a sleepless night months before. A melody I never labeled, never recorded, never intended to share. But he remembered it. Of course he did. Jungkook remembers details like their emotional timestamps etched into his DNA. And here's the painful truth. He didn't remember it because it was musically impressive. He remembered it because it was emotionally honest, because it belonged to a night when I wasn't pretending, when I didn't have the energy to posture, to polish, to curate the version of myself the world wanted. Back then, I thought silence was protection, that if I buried truth, he'd stay untouched by consequence. But consequence came anyway, not with headlines but distance, not with scandal but erosion, not with anger but emotional migration. There's a myth in fame that if you love someone deeply, the universe will preserve the moment until you're ready. But love doesn't preserve itself in vacuum. It either evolves into courage or devolves into regret. And I think that night in LA was the night regret started stretching its fingers toward me for the long haul. He never confronted me. He never asked for a confession. He never forced impossible conversations. But the absence of force doesn't mean absence of knowing. Jungkook's eyes used to ask quietly, "Are you brave enough for this?" And that night I answered with a smile that said, "Not yet." The smile that ends possibilities instead of opening them. I replay that night like a cursed track on loop, not because it was our peak, but because it was a crossroads, a silent crossroads, one where I should have pulled him aside, one where I should have risked the human truth instead of the curated safety. But curated safety is the religion of idols. You're trained to believe that honesty detonates careers, that vulnerability invites chaos, that headlines devour nuance. So you bury nuance, you bury honesty, you bury love, you bury yourself. And eventually, you realize you're no longer protecting them. You're protecting your own fear of impact. Fans love stories of connection. They crave emotional closeness with artists. They stay for the moments that feel like first-time truths. And this was mine. The first one. The one that should have been a doorway. Instead, it became a window I never climbed through. And maybe that's why I'm finally speaking now. Because if silence has already written the wound, then honesty at least deserves to narrate the scar. Jungkook was never mine to lose. He was mine to choose. And in LA, I didn't choose loudly enough. Not soon enough. Not bravely enough. And that's the night I realized heartbreak can begin not when someone leaves, but when you fail to walk toward them soon enough. Some people think connection is something that fades when you're busy. That schedules, flights, promotions, interviews, cameras, and constant expectations slowly thin emotional threads. But that's not how it works when you share years of life with someone. Connection doesn't disappear because you're busy. It disappears when one person keeps speaking in silence while the other keeps listening for words that never arrive. Jungkook never needed me to be loud for the world. He needed me to be loud for him. But I grew up in an industry that worships control, where feelings must be filtered, reactions measured, relationships kept ambiguous so they can be shared equally by millions without belonging fully to anyone. We're told that love makes idols dangerous, not because love is wrong, but because love gives artists a single destination, and idols are never supposed to have one. I want you to picture the moment when distance begins not with friction, but with realization. We were still in the US leg of the tour. Weeks after Lowe's Angels, weeks after the almost confession that I never delivered. Nothing looked wrong on camera. We were the same 7 silhouettes moving through corridors, greeting ARMY, cracking jokes, Jungkook teasing me about something stupid as usual. But the cadence had changed. The pauses between our sentences got just a fraction longer. The silence behind our laughter got a shade deeper. And I knew, deep down, he was waiting for a different kind of honesty than the kind we packaged for the world. There was a rehearsal night in New York that I keep replaying. The choreographer asked for a raw eye contact moment on a certain beat, the kind of moment that looks cinematic on screen. I met his eyes for half a second, but he looked past me, not with anger, with resignation. He didn't want to fake what we once did naturally. That hit harder than any confrontation, because confrontation gives you something to respond to. Resignation gives you nothing but a closing door. I started noticing the micro shifts. He stopped sharing ideas with me first. He stopped leaning in when silence used to feel warm. He started answering me like a friend instead of the person he once trusted without sentences. The hugs were still there, but shorter. The jokes still landed, but not in that deep, I-smile way that used to feel like emotional punctuation we both understood. The I-smiles are different now. They don't ask anymore. They conclude. People underestimate the weight of slow heartbreak. It doesn't roar. It rewrites posture. It trims conversations. It shortens the gaze. It makes the soul quieter. It turns Taehyung, listen to this, into I'll show it later if it's safe. It turns shared hotel nights into separate rooms without tension, just emotional logistics. It turns a connection that once felt like an unspoken language into a dialect you're no longer invited to speak. I used to think that love kept quiet was noble, that if I never said it, I was protecting BTS, protecting him, protecting the empire of unity that ARMY deserved. But protecting an empire while letting the person inside it fade is the cruelest paradox of fame, because the empire survives. The people inside it don't always get the same guarantee. Jungkook didn't need guarantees for the world. He needed a guarantee that I would defend what we were. And I never gave him that. Not because I didn't care, but because I feared impact more than regret. I feared headlines more than erosion. I feared losing a brand more than losing a person. And the tragic irony is, the brand would have survived honesty. What didn't survive was his hope that I'd speak it. Sometimes fans ask why certain moments feel different now, why glances look heavier in hindsight, why songs sound like confessions disguised as performances, why silences feel loaded with meaning even when nothing is said. It's because K-pop idols don't bleed in headlines. They bleed in intervals, in slow motion, in private rooms, in the moments after almost. This part of the story isn't about blaming him for pulling back. It's about realizing I was the first to step into silence, thinking he'd translate it forever. But translation requires material, and I gave him nothing but blank pages to decode. So eventually he stopped decoding, not out of bitterness but self-preservation. Self-preservation is quiet. It looks like distance. It sounds like healing. And healing is what scares me most now, because healing means you're no longer waiting for the one who wounded you to speak. And maybe that's the core of heartbreak no one talks about. Not that someone leaves you, but that they learn how to stand tall without needing your voice to confirm their worth anymore. Jungkook is standing tall now. I can feel it. And the tragedy isn't that he grew. It's that I wasn't brave enough to grow beside him when it mattered most. If heartbreak had a geography, part of mine would look like a hotel room window in Tokyo at 2 a.m. Glowing vending machines downstairs humming like tiny neon constellations, and a city breathing outside while two people stopped breathing in sync inside. That was months after the night in LA, months after the almost that never graduated into honesty. We were still touring, still orbiting each other professionally, but emotionally, the gravitational pull had changed coordinates. Jungkook was always someone who carried melodies the way other people carry diaries. He'd hum when he felt something too big for sentences, letting sound become a softer form of truth. I used to love that about him because it meant he didn't need to speak to be understood. But that night in Tokyo, the humming felt different. It wasn't a bridge. It was a monologue of its own, a soundtrack that didn't wait for a response anymore. He was lying sideways on the couch, one leg dangling off the edge like he didn't care about symmetry, his hair dark and messy in a way stylists would never intentionally approve, phone resting on his chest. The light from outside brushed his profile in gentle gradients, gold and shadow doing their quiet war. I was sitting on the floor nearby, back against the sofa, tuning my guitar. Not because I planned to play, but because instruments were easier to hold than truth. Strings don't ask for explanations. They don't look at you like you owe them a future you never promised. He glanced at me once, just once. A small, reflexive turn of the head. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't confrontational, it wasn't longing. It was something quieter. Recognition without invitation. Like seeing a familiar word in a language you no longer speak fluently. My fingers froze mid-chord. Not because I was afraid of his eyes, but because I knew what they used to ask, and I knew they weren't asking anymore. Fans sometimes imagine heartbreak between idols as an event, a visible rupture, a storm, a statement, a betrayal, a tearful ending. But the real heartbreak between us never had weather. It had climate change. Slow, unannounced, irreversible shifts in emotional temperature. The kind you don't notice until your heart tries to stand in a place that is no longer warm enough for it. I cleared my throat and asked if he was tired. The kind of small talk you use when your real question is too dangerous to phrase. He nodded and said, "Yeah, long day, short, neat, closed. No extra breath at the end like he used to leave for me to fill. No unspoken addendum that said, 'Sit here a little longer, Taehyung.' Just closure disguised as casual exhaustion." So I played a few quiet chords, nothing intentional, just air and vibration. The guitar hummed too, a parallel voice. He listened. Of course he listened. Jungkook always listens, but listening is different from waiting. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was just witnessing sound like fans witness rain, appreciative, present, not responsible for stopping it. There's a moment idols rarely admit out loud. The moment you realize the other person has started healing faster than you've started being honest. Healing isn't loud. Healing doesn't demand closure from the person who caused the wound. Healing simply relocates the heart, and his heart had already packed its bags by then. What hurt most wasn't losing his attention. It was losing his questions, because his questions were proof he once believed I could answer them bravely someday. And I never did. Not in Tokyo, not in New York, not in Seoul, not even in the silent spaces between songs ARMY memorized. The silence between us became bigger than the songs themselves. Fans often look at past clips, old glances, old hugs, old unfiltered smiles, and attach meanings that feel romantic or tragic depending on the day. But meaning isn't the problem. The problem is potential. Potential is what hurts. Because potential is a future that almost happened, a universe that briefly existed in draft form but never got published. Jungkook eventually stood up, stretched, grabbed a water bottle and said goodnight before heading to his room. No tension, no pause, no hesitation. The kind of departure that sounds ordinary unless you're the one who memorized every departure before it. He closed the door softly. A soft click, the quietest sound in the world, and yet it felt louder than any stadium encore. That was the night I realized something painfully simple. Jungkook didn't walk away from me. He walked toward himself. And the tragedy wasn't that he chose himself. The tragedy was that I made him feel like choosing himself was the only safe option left. If there is one thing fame does exceptionally well, it's convincing you that emotional postponement is a strategy instead of a sentence. You believe you can reschedule truth the way you reschedule interviews. You believe the people who orbit you will stay suspended in the same emotional frame until you are ready to speak your lines. But life doesn't work in frames. It works in momentum. And momentum doesn't ask for permission before it moves on. After Tokyo, after New York, after the slow climate shift that quietly changed everything, we came back to Seoul for a stretch of promotions. Cameras everywhere, flashing questions, endless movement. The world wanted reaction, charm, savage humor, poetic mystique. I could give them all of that on command. What I couldn't give them was the thing I never gave Jungkook either, unscripted emotional bravery. We were filming content for ARMY one afternoon, the kind of behind-the-scenes segment where laughter is a love language and chaos is the concept. Jungkook was across the room, trying to assemble something stupidly complicated that the staff told him not to touch. He laughed when it collapsed in his hands, that full-body laugh that begins in the diaphragm and ends in the eyes. The room responded to him instantly. That's the thing about Jungkook. His authenticity pulls responses out of people before they even think about them. It pulled responses out of me too, once. Now it mostly pulled regret. I walked toward him, pretending I was there to tease him like usual. And I did tease him. I said something sarcastic about how he could break the laws of physics but not a single tripod. He grinned. A small one. The polite kind. The "you're still my Taehyung but not my translator anymore" kind. And for the first time, the distance between us felt less like longing and more like proof of consequence I had earned. I sat beside him for a moment anyway. Not because I thought it would change anything, but because consequences deserve witnesses too. He wasn't uncomfortable. That's what hurt. He was neutral. Neutral is what healing looks like when it has stopped needing the other person to narrate it. I asked him what he was building. He said he wasn't sure. Another laugh. Short. Light. Not the diary hum, not the confession frequency, just a casual sound. And then he showed me the wreckage in his hands like it was the only safe metaphor left between us. We laughed together at the collapse, but we weren't collapsing together anymore. Only the tripod was. Fans don't know this, but there's a different kind of heartbreak that blooms when you finally sit beside someone again, and you realize you're no longer the first person they want to share even their smallest chaos with. Not because they hate you, but because their heart has stopped considering you a necessary destination for emotional safety. I used to think that love kept quiet was dignified, that it protected the seven of us, that it preserved the myth of BTS as something indivisible, eternal, a fixed emotional universe. But myths don't protect people. Myths protect audiences. People need something messier, something realer, something braver, something spoken. The industry trained me to believe that silence is armor, that ambiguity is generosity, that measured reactions are safety protocols. And yes, silence can be armor, but armor is heavy when you're the one wearing it alone. I realized that I never actually feared the headlines. I feared the vulnerability that could produce them. I feared that if I spoke about Jungkook honestly, it would expose a truth that wasn't marketable, symmetrical, or easy to distribute to millions without belonging to one person too clearly. But here's the twist. Truth doesn't need to be marketable to matter. It only needs to be spoken before distance becomes doctrine. Jungkook never made distance doctrine. I did. Every time he asked for honesty and I answered with presence instead of sentences. Every time his eyes said, "Tell me the real version," and I answered with a smile that sounded like, "Not here, not now." Every time I assumed his patience was infinity. Patience isn't infinity. It's time with a deadline. And maybe that's why fans felt heartbroken when I finally spoke. Not because the story is scandalous, but because it is human. Because they recognize the slow heartbreak pattern too. The one that doesn't explode. The one that quietly changes the air around a once shared heart. So yeah, that was the season in Seoul when I realized that heartbreak isn't the absence of love. It's the absence of courage that love required to stay alive in the same orbit. One thing people rarely understand about idols is that emotions don't vanish when they're not declared. They fossilize. They become sediment under the surface of everything you say except the thing you needed to say. By the time we reached the final legs of promotions in Seoul, my silence had already evolved into a version of me that knew regret by first name. Jungkook never turned cold. He just stopped turning toward me first. That subtlety is the kind of nuance the public never sees but ARMY somehow always feels. There was an evening after a recording session, one of those sessions where vocal layers stack like emotional architecture. Jungkook had nailed a take that made the producers exchange looks like they'd witnessed something historic. The room exhaled for him. I held my breath for myself. When the recording wrapped, the hallway outside felt quieter than any practice room midnight. I found him standing there, bottle of iced coffee in hand, staring at nothing specific, like he was just waiting for the elevator. I used to interpret his quiet as an open chair for me, but that night the chair was gone. The quiet was self-contained. I said, "Killer take, JK." It sounded casual, supportive, identical to the compliments we give each other on camera. He said thanks, and the sentence ended there. No extra beat of silence. No microhum of connection after, just a clean period. I didn't realize how much I relied on the unspoken until the unspoken stopped happening. I leaned against the wall beside him anyway. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the way someone stands beside a memory. The elevator dinged, doors sliding open like indifferent choreography. We stepped in, side by side physically, universes apart emotionally. The ride was only a few floors, but heartbreak compresses time into slow motion. The lights above us were sterile, industrial white, humming faintly. I could hear the elevator's mechanics more clearly than my own thoughts. Jungkook sipped his coffee, unbothered, present. No tension, no emotional turbulence. That lack of turbulence felt like proof of healing I had not yet earned. Fame makes you fluent in performance and illiterate in confrontation. But the truth is, I never needed confrontation. I needed courage before it got to confrontation. Jungkook wasn't waiting for an emotional explosion. He was waiting for an emotional sentence. ARMY sometimes asks why the quiet members carry the loudest hearts. Maybe it's because loud hearts are safest when they're diffused into millions. But the most painful hearts are the ones that wanted a single safe listener and never spoke soon enough to keep them. There was a moment during a later interview where someone asked us about emotional support between members. My instinct was to give the practiced answer: 7 pillars, unshakable, brothers, each other's home. But for the first time, I felt the answer fracture inside me even if it didn't fracture in my voice. Because home isn't built on unsaid sentences. Home is built on saying the dangerous thing while you still have emotional real estate left to build it on. Jungkook eventually finished his coffee, stepped out when the elevator stopped and said, "Night, Taehyung," before walking toward his studio. The casual good night we've said 1,000 times, but this time it felt like an echo of a language that once meant more. I said good night back, and even that felt late. Some heartbreaks are public, some heartbreaks are poetic, but the worst heartbreaks are administrative, quietly processed. No ceremony, no explosion, no closure demanded, just the gradual relocation of emotional importance. And I think that's why fans were heartbroken hearing me speak now. Not because I lost him in a dramatic way, but because they recognized the pattern. The slow fade that happens when someone who once looked at you like you held subtitles for their heart slowly stops needing subtitles at all. Jungkook didn't fail to hold on to us. I failed to speak loudly enough to deserve the space he once left open. So this is where the story lands. Not with a collision, but clarity. People keep asking why I spoke now, why I let the world hear a part of my heart I used to guard like classified material. The truth is simple and terrifying. Silence already did the damage. I'm not speaking to undo it. I'm speaking because it finally deserves a witness. An army has always been the safest witness for the things we can't always say to each other. Jungkook is still one of my favorite people on earth. That fact never expired. What expired was my belief that timing was something I could negotiate. If I could go back and talk to my younger self, I'd tell him that love isn't protected by being hidden. It's protected by being claimed bravely before distance files the paperwork. But youth is arrogant. It mistakes patience for infinity and hesitation for wisdom. I confused both. I don't want this to sound like a plea or a tragedy script where someone is a villain. Jungkook didn't break anything. I broke a moment's future by assuming it didn't need words to survive. He moved forward not out of spite but self-respect. And if you love someone, even silently, you eventually learn that self-respect is not the enemy of connection. Fear is. Fans often romanticize the bond between us, the almost telepathic understanding, the glances that felt like a private universe, the laughter that sounded like inside jokes even when no one else was in the room. And yes, those moments were real, real enough to ache. But what makes a moment lasting isn't intensity. It's articulation. It's saying, "This matters to me and I'm brave enough to carry the impact." Jungkook carried impact every day just by being sincere. I admired that from afar, maybe a little too far. What I hope ARMY takes from this hour-long journey isn't sadness, but recognition. That even idols who look poetic and self-contained can be cowardly when it comes to their own heart. That distance can be gentle. That heartbreak can be quiet. That healing can be loud only after the person who should have spoken didn't speak soon enough. And that love doesn't vanish just because it was late. It just lives in the past tense. I'm okay with that now, not numb, just honest. Jungkook is shining brighter than ever. I see it in the way he carries himself, the way his voice doesn't just hit notes but lifts people, the way he laughs like someone who has made peace with his own timeline. And I think, deep down, part of me always knew he'd reach that place, with or without my sentences. I just hoped it would be with. But hope is not a substitute for courage. Still, I'm grateful. Grateful that the moments happened at all. Grateful that ARMY loved us loudly even when we didn't always love ourselves bravely. Grateful that BTS let me grow up slowly in public without stripping me of the right to speak eventually. Grateful that Jungkook taught me what sincerity looks like even if I was afraid to mirror it back then. If you made it all the way here, thank you. Truly. I know a 1-hour video is a commitment. The fact that you stayed means you didn't come for the drama. You came for the human truth under the spotlight. And that means more than charts, more than narratives, more than the armor of silence I used to wear. I hope you talk to the people you care about before later becomes too late. That's the only advice heartbreak has ever given me that feels like mercy. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for letting me break the silence in a place where it finally felt safe to fall into words instead of distance. I love you, ARMY. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And thank you, always. When you spend years under the spotlight, you start to believe that the public already knows the shape of your heart just because they can recognize your voice. But a voice and a heart aren't the same instrument. One is trained. One is lived. People used to say Jungkook and I balanced each other. Him, instinct. Me, contemplation. Him, sincerity without hesitation. Me, sincerity wrapped in layers of restraint. On camera, that difference looked complementary. Off camera, it sometimes looked like a sentence that kept being revised and never finalized. I remember a small moment during an award show season. Not the ceremony itself, but the rehearsal before. Jungkook was practicing his speech, not reading from paper but improvising lines out loud, editing them in real time with his own voice. He wasn't trying to make the speech perfect. He was trying to make it true enough to carry his name. I was watching from a distance again, pretending I was checking my outfit on a reflection. But really, I was studying courage in its most casual form. He paused, looked up at me and asked, "Taehyung, does this sound like me?" Not, "Does it sound good?" Not, "Will it go viral?" Just, "Does it sound like me?" I nodded and said it did. But the real answer was that it sounded like the part of him that never feared being honest about himself. And that was the part I admired and envied quietly. Envy is a bitter word, so let's reframe it. It wasn't envy of his shine. It was envy of his honesty to impact ratio. Because impact comes for all of us in fame, whether we ask for it or not. The only difference is whether you greet it with truth or try to outmaneuver it with silence. Fans think idols hide emotions because they're curated. That's partially correct. But the deeper reason is fear. Fear of consequence, fear of misinterpretation, fear of creating a narrative that doesn't distribute itself equally to millions. But Jungkook never feared misinterpretation. He feared inauthenticity. And that's a different kind of fear, one that pushes you toward truth, not away from it. There was a period when I started writing songs more intensely, pouring things into melodies I didn't pour into conversations. Music was my safest confession booth. Jungkook would listen sometimes when I played fragments during late practice nights. He'd never interrupt, just absorb. But one night he said something that has lived in my chest like an emotional sticky note. Taehyung, songs are honest, but people need honesty spoken in their own language too, not just sung. It wasn't a critique. It was a key I didn't use at the time, but a key nonetheless. And I think that's what made ARMY love Jungkook so fiercely. Not just the talent, but the truth bandwidth he offered. ARMY doesn't stay for perfection. They stay for resonance. They stay because they can feel when someone is speaking from the unfiltered channel, not the broadcast channel. Distance, I've learned, isn't always about absence. It can be about admiration without participation. And that's where Jungkook and I lived for a while, me admiring, him living forward, neither of us enemies, neither of us close in the way we once were, but still coexisting in the same professional universe. A universe that ARMY mistook as emotional permanence. I don't blame them. Emotional permanence is what they deserved from us. They just didn't know that permanence requires sentences, not silence. I've also realized something healing adjacent, if not healing itself. Jungkook never resented me for being quiet. He just stopped depending on me to stop being quiet someday. Dependence and love aren't the same frequency either. Love can survive independence. It just can't survive unspoken forever. ARMY listens to us like meteorologists of emotion. They feel storms and climate shifts we never announce. And maybe that's why I'm finally learning to speak in sentences instead of glances. Not to reclaim the past, but to honor the fact that it existed. To let the silence have a transcript at last. To let admiration grow into articulation instead of distance. So if you're listening to this, maybe ask yourself this. Are you revising your truth into silence too, hoping someone will stay long enough to decode it? Decode while there is still time. Decode while the elevator door is still open. Decode while the coffee is still warm. Decode while later still means soon, not past. Because the saddest part of any bond isn't when it breaks. It's when it becomes a draft you never publish. And thank you for letting me publish mine tonight.